Gouache is a water-based paint similar to watercolor, with the main difference being the opacity. It's a versatile paint that is bright and vivid and dries to a matte finish. It usually comes in tubes and has a creamy texture, and I like my gouache to be readily available, so I store it in an airtight palette that allows them to stay wet for days to weeks. My favorite paper to use with gouache is Strathmore Tone 10 Mixed Media. Not to be confused with regular tone tan paper, as the mixed media is much thicker so it can handle water-based media. Any brushes used for watercolor can also be used for gouache. I personally tend to gravitate towards flat brushes, and here are a few of my favorite brushes to use with gouache. Like watercolor, the value of gouache can be determined by the concentration of the paint. In this exercise, I'll generate a gradient by progressively diluting the paint as I work downward towards the bottom of the first rectangle. In this exercise, I'm using a Princeton Velvetouch 1-inch wash brush, and the color I'm using is Payne's Gray. In addition to the concentration of the paint, white gouache can also be used to control the value. In the second column, I will create a gradient by progressively mixing in more white paint as I paint downward. I'm mixing the white into the Payne's Gray puddle on the palette and slowly adding more and more as I reach the bottom. In the third column, I'll show you how to create a gradient by layering white on an already dry layer of color. So after I apply the first layer, I dry it with the hairdryer, and to that I add white and blend it upwards. In this exercise, we'll be making a color wheel using vermillion, yellow ochre, and Payne's Gray. This is a nice beginner palette if you struggle with getting more subdued colors, especially when using the traditional primaries of red, yellow, and blue. So we'll start off by constructing a circle divided into 12 even parts, and then label every fourth wedge with one of the primary colors. I'm using a butcher tray as my mixing surface, to which I will add a puddle of vermilion and make sure to add a few spare puddles for when I mix colors. The same thing with yellow ochre, a couple extra spare puddles, and likewise for Payne's Gray. I apply an even layer of vermilion to the corresponding wedge, using a Princeton Velvetouch 1/2-inch angled shader brush. Next, I fill in the corresponding yellow ochre wedge with the appropriate color, and likewise for Payne's Gray to complete the three primary colors of the color wheel. On to the secondaries, I start off with a 50-50 mixture of vermilion and yellow ochre. Move on to a 50-50 Payne's Gray yellow ochre, and then lastly a 50-50 Payne's Gray and vermilion. And now for the tertiary colors. This time I'm making a vermilion dominant mixture with Payne's Gray, and then this time a Payne's Gray dominant, and so on and so forth, where the color adjacent to the primary will be the dominant color in the mixture. At this point, I'm adding white to each wedge in order to create a gradient, where the color fades to white as you move from circumference to center. Since gouache can be always reactivated with water, it makes it easy to blend even once the paint has dried on the paper, so you can get a smooth gradient to get the final color wheel. For this one, I'm gonna start with a burnt umber base coat, just because the yellow ochre probably won't really show up too much on this toned paper. And as far as the brush I'm using the size 1 wash brush. I start off applying a pretty dilute layer of the burnt umber, and my main objective is just to cover the page. After using a hairdryer to completely dry that first base layer, I come back in with another more concentrated mixture of the burnt umber, and this time around it's to do a value study of the reference photo. Now to my palette, I'm adding white, Payne's gray, and mixing it with a little bit of the burnt umber and applying that over the base layer. I'm using a 1/2" Princeton Neptune wash brush, and the paint is currently not very opaque yet. For the front of the face, I mix up a little bit more Payne's gray and burnt umber with less white and apply it to the forehead as well as the lower front of the face. The back of the statue seems to be a bit brighter than the front, so I'm using more white in these paint mixtures in order to raise the value. Painting, each layer is getting more and more opaque, using more thicker paint. And I also switched over to my angled shader brush. The front planes of the statue have some of the darkest values overall. So in those paint mixtures, I'm using the least amount of white and more Payne's gray / burnt umber. So I want to better blend out this white, get smoother transition. So I'm going to do that just by using a round brush filled with clean water. This is a size 12 round Princeton Neptune brush. So I'm just going to go in. Since gouache can always be reactivated with water, you can soften edges just by coming in with clean water like I'm doing now. And it blends nicely together, just like melted butter. With this, it's important not to scrub too hard. Just more lightly blend. You can drop in other color. Basically, I'm just glazing with white paint just to lighten up the values a bit. I won't be able to tell the effect until it dries. That's the last thing to do. Just add a few, sharpen up a couple details, and wrap this one up. Overall, I really like gouache a lot because of its versatility, meaning because it's opaque, you can use it on various different tone papers like I'm doing now. I really like working on top of this tone tan paper, mainly because having a mid-tone paper and adding white highlights really makes the image sort of pop off, and it gives it a bit of dimensionality to it, and it's just fun to work with. So with that, this is the final piece. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I hope this was helpful, and I hope you go out and try out some gouache. It's really fun and you won't regret it. So thank you, and see you in the next one.